Hi, Dave Scotland for cgswot.com, and welcome to another tutorial. And today we're going to take a look at a compositing process, and it's this stormy fantasy scene. And if you're interested at all in completing this from start to finish, I've got a workshop that will be available shortly, and I'll take you through the steps of creating all the assets for this process. But for this tutorial, it's just the compositing side of things, and we're going to create this scene here. We'll take a quick look. So as you can see, it's a pretty simple scene, but it has a very cinematic feel. It's more of an establishing shot, and I think it's a great scene to cut your teeth with. It's got a sort of a matte painting orientation to it. So let's get started, and we'll have a look at the assets that we've got to work with. So if we have a look in our project window here, you'll notice that I've got two beauty passes. We've got the standard cliff face, and we've also got a lightning beauty pass as well. Now you will see that there's a very different, I might just lock this and put this side by side. We'll have a look at the lightning one as well. And you'll see that the shadows on the lightning pass are very different. The lighting direction is a lot brighter, but it's also from a radically different direction. And that's going to become a lot more apparent later on when we do our final lightning pass. Most people, when they're compositing lightning, what they do is they try to process globally the entire shot using exposure, blowing out the sort of light values in the scene. And that's not the way lightning actually works. Lightning is caused by a very bright light source in the sky, and it's usually coming from a very different direction to your key light source. And therefore the shadows are different, the sides of objects are going to be illuminated differently, and it also has, it brings out a lot more detail in the scene. You'll notice here the shadows are a lot stronger, a lot sharper, and it just brings a lot of extra believability to the actual shot. So that's going to become apparent a little bit later on. We've also got a reflections pass, and we've got a shadow pass, just to bring a little bit of extra shadow detail to the scene. And we've got a specular lighting pass, which is a lot of this fine rock detail on the cliffs. We've got a tree render. Now this render was created in Vue, and Vue's got some great processes that allow you to take foliage and to bring a little bit of wind to the foliage. And we're going to use this just to bring a little bit of life to the scene. We've also got our clouds background, and it's just a still also created in Vue, so a sort of gloomy cloudscape behind our cliffs. And we've got our waterfall. Now the waterfall was created in 3D Studio Max just using materials, and if you do go ahead and do the full workshop, I'll show you how to create these waterfall effects in 3D Studio Max. And so they're the assets we have to work with. It's always good to assess your assets before you start any compositing process. So the first thing we need to do is create our master comp. So let's go ahead and create a new composition. This is our master comp, and we're going to be working 1280 720, 25 frames per second and 100 frames long, so 4 seconds, and we'll go OK to that. Let's go ahead and bring our beauty pass down and start to lay in our passes. We also have our shadows pass. We'll pull that down on top, and our shadows need to be a multiply layer. So it's just off screen, but make sure you set the mode to multiply. Now you'll see that we're getting some fringing, and that's actually going to get worse when I do this next process. What I'm going to do is I really want to soften those shadows, so I'm going to highlight that layer, right click, blur sharpen, fast blur, repeat on edges, and just crank those shadows up until we really soften those shadows out across the cliff face there. Something like that is fine. Now in order to get rid of this fringing here, which is going out into our transparency area, we're just going to duplicate our beauty pass, Control D, and I'm going to pull it up and on top of our shadows, and I'm going to set that beauty pass as an alpha matte, and that's going to give us our nice area there. Now we're still getting a little bit of fringing there, so I'm just going to take that beauty pass And I'm going to right click, matte, simple choke. And I'm just going to choke it down a little bit to get rid of that fringing across the top of the cliffs. So with or without those shadows, you can see that we're just getting a little bit of extra shadow detail up the top on the rocks, and especially down in this area. It's just softening that shadow. We'll go ahead and bring our other layers down. So we have our reflections pass. We'll pull that down on top of our shadows, and we're going to set that as a screen. Now it brightens everything quite a lot. So we're just going to highlight and pull in a color corrections curves. Actually, we'll use levels instead. So we'll go color correction and levels, and you can see that everything's right up the top end of the histogram there. So we're just going to bring it down slightly, probably about there, and then just going to clamp it up a little bit more. Something like that should be fine. And you can see if I toggle that on and off, how much extra highlight detail or reflection detail we're getting on those rock surfaces there. So I might just bring that up slightly, just fine tune it, something like that. It's going to work nicely. Now we want to leave ourselves a little bit of room, because when we do our lightning pass later, we're going to really bring that into an extreme area. So that's going to be fine for where we are. We'll go ahead and bring down our specular lighting. That can go on top. What the specular lighting is going to do, if we set that to a screen overlay, if we come in here, toggle that on and off, and you'll see that the specular pass actually brings a lot of specular detail into some of these shadow areas, which is really going to help the process. So I'm just going to hit T and bring the opacity down on that just slightly, pull it down to about 75, and that's looking pretty good. So we've got all of our layers in place for our cliff. So let's go ahead and select all of those, and we're going to pre-comp. We're going to pre-comp that as cliff only, and we're going to move all attributes and go OK. So back in our master comp, we've just got our cliff only there. We're going to pull our clouds down underneath, and we're also going to, I'm just going to pull this across. We don't really use it that much. It's just taking up valuable screen real estate. And on top of that, we'll pull our waterfall on top of our cliffs, and on top of that, we'll pull our trees on top. So for now, we've got our layers in place, and we're actually going to be compositing these in as 3D layers, so we can do a little bit of a camera push in to give some nice parallax, especially with these trees in the foreground. So let's go ahead and toggle our switches and turn everything to 3D layers, and we're going to just jump into a 2-view horizontal so you can see how things are working here. Now on the left view here, I'm going to go to a left view, and this one is the active camera. So if I select my clouds and push those back in Z space in this left view, probably about there is fine. And then over here in my camera view, holding shift, I'm just going to zoom those back up. Now I want to grab the cliff and the waterfall because they are pretty much in the same Z space from the camera, so they're going to go back to pretty much the same area. That looks pretty good. And then grab the trees. In fact, the trees can stay where they are, so just grab the waterfall and the cliff layer, hold shift while you reposition and drag those back up. And we're going to go ahead and create a camera at this point. It's always good to get a good idea of the movement that's happening so that you don't, down the track, start working on elements that the camera doesn't even see. So it's good to get that camera in there. These elements were rendered and created using a 35mm camera, virtual camera, so I'm going to stick with that. And just while we're in this left view, I'm going to right click on that camera. In fact, we'll do it from up here. Just go layer, transform, auto orient, and switch that off. We don't want to target on our camera. It's a very unnatural way to control cameras using a target. So you'll see that we need to reposition, or not reposition, but rescale some of our assets up to match our new camera in the scene. So just pull that sky back up as well. And we're just going to animate this camera. Very simple, push in. So just open up the position and orientation keys. We might not use orientation. So at frame 0, just click on the stopwatches and then come through to our last frame. And we're just going to push in. We want to push past those trees. And we want them to be just off shot. Probably about there should do it. And that way those trees are going to be in shot for most of the shot. And then what we might do is just slightly push the camera up a little bit as well. And that's going to work okay. The trees sort of disappear off shot at about frame 75. And that's going to work nicely. So let's go ahead and go back to a single view. And let's do a RAM preview. Always when you're animating, don't rely on what it looks like when you scrub. Do a RAM preview and just make sure that the movement is actually working correctly. So we're getting some nice parallax there. I think that's working fine. In fact, what we'll do at this point is I'm going to push my clouds back even further into the shot, just to get a little bit of extra parallax on those clouds, and just scale those back up again. And so now we're just getting a little bit more parallax on the clouds. That's working well. Okay, so our scene is coming together. What we need to do also is pre-comp our waterfall and start working on our waterfall elements. But before we do, I like to get some sort of temporary color correction in there that's close to my final color correction, or at least a starting point, so that as I'm working on these pre-comps, I'm getting a good idea of how they're coming together in a color corrected environment. So I'm just going to go new adjustment layer, and we'll rename that color correction. I'm just going to pull it down on top of everything. It doesn't need to be a 3D layer. And we're going to just put a color correction curves in there. And I'm just going to drop down the overall luminance value of the whole shot. Just drop it down. And then I'm also going to pull a bit of red out of it and increase a little bit of blue in there. Something like that looks fine. And then I'm just going to color correct. It's just off screen, but I'm using a tint. And wind that down to 0 and just start to wind it in until it gives me the right sort of desaturation that I need for a night shot like this. And it's coming together quite nicely. I think what I'll do after the tint is put on another color correction curves, and I'm just going to introduce a little bit more blue and pull out some of that red, and that's looking pretty good. And maybe just darken that slightly again. That's probably okay for what we're looking at, and we can fine-tune this later on. Like I said, it's a temporary starting point for color correction. Now that we've got our color correction in place, I'm just going to grab the waterfall and we're going to pre-comp that. So if we pre-compose, we'll just call this waterfall only, and we'll leave all attributes. That way we'll leave the 3D layer in place, and we'll go OK. So this is a 2D layer back in the pre-comp, and back in the master comp it's still the 3D layer and it's still in the right position. So we've got our waterfall here, and we need to do a little bit of treatment to it. So I'm just going to grab the waterfall. I'm going to go layer, new, solid. And I'm going to make this a sort of a pale blue color. Something like that is okay. Not too much color to it. And pull it down underneath our waterfall. And what I'm going to do is use our waterfall as a luma matte. So just luma matte, and that gives us this pale waterfall there, and probably a little bit too much color. So I'm just going to amend the highlight the solid. I'm just going to amend that solid color, just taking a little bit of that color out, and that should be fine. So I've got my waterfall, and I'm just going to bring down a beauty pass underneath, and this is going to be just a guide layer. So just set that, right click, set that to a guide layer, and that way it won't render back in our main comp, but it'll help us to see how it's sharing the space here, and any masking that we need to do. So for this waterfall layer here, what I'm going to do is highlight both, Control D, and just hide the top one for now. I'm just going to grab this waterfall layer that we used to luma matte the solid, and I'm going to add a blur sharpen fast blur, and probably put about a 1 pixel fast blur on it. Just subtle, but it's enough to take some of those fine striations out of the water. And I'm also going to, I'll unhide this one. Now if I take the very top waterfall layer, and we're going to place a directional blur on this one. So if I leave it at 0 and just crank it up until we get some nice directional blur on it, and that's working pretty well. You'll notice though that we're getting this stretched effect at the top here. So if we just select the pale cyan, or the solid that we created, I'm just going to mask this out. Just come across roughly about the top of the lip there, and we want to set this to subtract. Hit F, bring up the feather settings, and just feather that out. Something like that is fine. And you can see if I hide and unhide that it makes quite a lot of difference. And we might just hit on the bottom solid, just hit T for transparency, and just bring that transparency down a little bit on that solid underneath. Probably, let's make it about 65%, and that's going to work okay. So I'm just going to bring down another copy of the waterfall, which is here. Pull it down on top, and I'm just going to isolate it for a sec. Now the effect I'm going to use, what I want to do is bring out some specular highlights on this waterfall. Now I could have rendered them, but I wanted to show you a quick and easy way. So there's an effect called CC Glass, and I'm just going to grab it, pull it down onto my layer, and you'll see what it does is it sort of embosses it. It displaces what we're working with, whatever the layer is that we're working with. So at the moment it's set to lightness. What I'm going to do is set that to alpha. I'm going to pull down the ambient light. I'm also going to pull down the diffuse, and you'll see that we're starting to get just this specular highlight. So if I pull the softness out of it, you'll see now that we're starting to get this detail into our waterfall. And you just fine-tune these settings until you get exactly what you're looking for. So I might go a little bit more on the specular, and we'll unhide our other layers for now. And at the moment we're getting that darkness in there as well, so we're just going to have that as a screen overlay, and we can see what we're looking at now. Now I've got that directional blur over the top. I might just see if this looks okay between our other two layers, and I think it's working okay. And instead of screen I might just go with an add, and you can see that we're getting some nice movement there, some specularity. So I might just pull that displacement, the specular value down just slightly, and let's have a look at the height. I think the height's okay, and the displacement I think is okay. I think we're pretty close to where we need to be with this effect. It's a little bit sharp on the highlights, so what I might do is just pull that on top, and then after the effect I'm just going to pull a blur sharpen fast blur, and I'm just going to fine tune that slightly. So a single pixel is all we needed there, and that's going to work just nicely. Now I'm just going to hit T. I'm going to drop it back in opacity a little bit, and that's working pretty well. So come back to my master comp. I'm just going to see how this is working. Getting a little bit of an iridescent sort of feel to it. So I'm just going to highlight the waterfall only. This is in the master comp. And I'm just going to put a color correction tint. And instead of white, I'm just going to bring this color out of that white. We'll stay in that blue spectrum. So probably come down. That's probably going to do us. That's going to work okay. So we're looking pretty good. Come back to our waterfall only, and I'm going to grab everything except for our reference layer at the bottom. I'll go layer, pre-compose, and we'll call this water, let's call it water geometry, or let's just call it water only, because we are going to create some particles. So if I go OK to that, we now have our water only, and it's a single layer back in our waterfall only. So let's go ahead and create some particles. Just going to go layer, new, solid. This one's particles 01, and go OK. And I might just adjust that solid to a black. Not for any real reason other than I like to put my particles on black layers. Gives me options later if I want to screen, do anything with the screen or an add layer. So I'm going to use trap code particular for this tutorial. So just come down, we'll just go effect, trap code and particular. And I might just hide the waterfall for now. Just come in here. So what we want to do is set up our particle emitter from a point, and we're going to use a box instead. I'm just going to reposition it over to where the bottom lip is, and we don't need any Z, and I can pull the Y out as well. And instead of uniform, we're going to go directional, and you can now see the width that we need. Probably about there should be fine. For now, we can fine tune this in a moment. Now we're directional, which means if I rotate this around a little bit, you'll see that it's coming out directionally, and that's exactly what we want. So I'll just undo that, and you'll notice that our face is not quite front on to the camera, so we want to pull this into the negative a little bit and just rotate it slightly back the other way. I'd say -4 should do us, and that's going to work okay. So the next thing we need to do is get the velocity right. So I'm going to leave it at 100. I'm going to pull the velocity random up to 100, but what's really going to give us our movement is gravity. So down in the physics section, I'm going to wind the gravity up until it gives me the speed that I'm looking for. So I'm just going to RAM preview that just to see if the speed is okay. It's not too bad. What you have to remember is that our waterfall speed is one of the main things in the scene that actually give the scene scale. We don't really know how big this statue is. We don't know how big these rocks are. This rock up here could be 100 feet tall, or it could be 10 feet tall. And the only thing that's really going to give us scale, it's not the trees in the foreground, because they could be really close to the camera, and this cliff could be 400 meters away. So it's the things, the visual cues that the viewer is going to make sense of the scale. And in this instance, it's really the speed of the waterfall. So we need to make sure that we get this thing right. So with both of those layers visible, the waterfall only and the particles, we just want to make sure that the speed of these particles are right. So we'll just have a look there. And I think they're working fine. So they're looking good so far. So let's come into these, let's hide that waterfall again, come in, and let's set up some particle settings here. What I want to do is just come down to my emitter extras, and I'm going to set up 100 frame pre-runs, just so that at frame 0 we've got particles in the scene. And I also want to set up my particle size. I'm going to set the particle size to about 0.75, And they're very hard to see, but I want to set the random size up to 100, and that puts different size particles in the scene, and that's going to work okay. Now let's go ahead and crank up the amount of particles in the shot and give that a little bit of a render. We might just set up, while we're in the particle section, just set up a little bit of opacity random as well. And that should be good. And then take out any feather on those particles. So let's go ahead and see if they're falling okay. And they're looking pretty good. So we've got some pretty good particles happening there. So that's going to do us for our first layer. And what we want to do, if I switch on my waterfall here, you'll see we're getting this hard line up here. So let's just reposition our emitter here for a second. Just pull it up to about here. And then let's minimize that hard line a little bit. First of all, let's get a little bit of directional spread in there. Probably about 26 is going to do us. Actually, for this layer, let's leave it a little bit low. So that's not too bad. Okay, so what we're going to do is just create a new solid, and we'll just call this mask 01. Go OK, and with mask 01 selected, I'm just going to create just a bit of a mask on that solid, and I'm going to set it as an alpha matte inverted, and you'll see that we've chopped that off there. So on that mask solid now, just hit F and put a bit of a feather on that. What that does is takes that hard line of particles that we were getting there, and that's working pretty well. Looks like we're getting, just going to jump into this water only layer, and I might just copy my cliff reference layer, Control V, stick that at the bottom, so it's still a reference layer, you can tell by the icon. And I'm just going to, it's this one here. What I'm going to do is just put a little bit of a mask on the top here and invert that to a subtract. Hit F and feather that. I just don't like all of that detail that we're getting up the top there. Might need to just move that mask a little bit. I'm trying to minimize some of that detail at the top there. Maybe the feather's a little bit too harsh. I think that's going to work okay. Yeah. Yep, that works fine. So we've got our particles, our one layer of our particles, and at the moment they look a little bit like pixie dust, and that's because we're missing the most important thing, and that is the sense of movement. Doesn't really work without motion blur. So instead of comp settings, I'm going to force the motion blur, and you can see now we have to make a reassessment of the size of our particles and the amount of our particles. So you can see there that we can probably go a little bit more on the size. Let's pull that up to 1 on the size, and let's pull the amount up a little bit on that as well. Let's give it a little bit more directional spread. That's probably enough. It's going to work okay. And we're going to set that layer to a screen. And those particles are working pretty well. You will notice I'm seeing a lot more particles on this side than the other. So let's go ahead and just, with our emitter, instead of -4, we'll go say -5, -6. And that's probably going to do us. So I'm going to duplicate these two, Control D, and I'm going to pull that duplication down behind the waterfall, and we're going to amend some settings here. So I'm just going to hide the top particles. So what we're looking at here are particles that are behind the waterfall, and I'm going to grab the amount, play with that a little bit, Down in the random seed, I'm going to set that to just a different number. 100 will do us, just so that those particles don't match. And also a little bit of directional spread as well. Not too much. That should do it. And we're also going to reduce the amount of gravity slightly. So I'm just going to go 120 on that gravity, just so that we've got particles behind the waterfall that are not quite falling at exactly the same rate as the other ones. I'm also going to increase the life to 4 seconds on the particles. We'll make that 6 seconds because we did do a pre-run of 100. In fact, 8 is the right length, and that's probably going to do us. Just while we're doing that, we'll do the same with the other particles. Just make sure that that's 8 seconds as well, and that way we won't get any particles disappearing in the shot. So let's switch them both on now. So we're looking pretty good. Just the particles behind, I'm just going to reduce the amount a little bit. Well, I'll leave the amount up, but I'm going to reduce the size. So I'm just going to go 0.5 on the size of those. So it's going to be subtle, and if I switch them off and on, you'll see that it makes a big difference. In fact, by looking at it, I think what I'm going to do is leave the size of these ones to 1, or let's go 0.8. But the ones on top, I'm going to reduce the size. So we go 0.5 on the ones on top, and maybe increase the amount a little bit on those. There we go. So that's working pretty well. Let's come back to our master comp. Always refer back to your master comp for a RAM preview, for a review of your work, because remember that it's your master comp that is that's the output that the viewer is going to be looking at, and so it's very important that your master comp is working. So it looks to me like the particles are fine. Most of the water is fine, but that specular pass that we have on the water, let's have a look at it. It's just too dominant. So let's go into that waterfall layer, and let's go back up to that top. I think what we need to do is bring out a little bit more detail on it. So let's come down here. Let's play with the light. Let's bring the light intensity down a little bit. Bring the light height up. Maybe just play with the angle a little bit. And let's pull the softness out of it. Height down. Displacement's looking pretty good. Let's see how that's working. I think that's working okay. And instead of add, let's go with screen. Just hit T and bring the transparency up on that one. So I think that's going to work okay. Before it was just way too much. We'll give this a RAM preview and see if we can just pick up those little subtle highlights that are coming over that waterfall. Yeah, I think that's working really well. I'm just picking up a bit of a hard lip on the geometry for the face, and I just want to get rid of that, and then I think we're fine. So just in the water only, I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to create a new solid, layer new solid. I'm going to just pick on the watercolor here, and I'm going to drag it all the way down underneath our waterfall, and just going to hide it for a second, and I'm going to create just a little bit of a mask, sort of a random looking shaped mask is going to do us. Switch that back on now, and F for feather. Just hide this mask for a second. Just feather that out, and maybe even just bring up those mask settings, and let's play with this a little bit here. probably going to do it. And we might just hit T, and bring the opacity of that down a little bit. So we'll see how that's working. And that's working pretty well. It was just enough to take a little bit of the heat out of that hard line that was going across there. So I think the waterfall is fine now, and we're good to go with the rest of our master comp build, which is all atmospherics now. But that waterfall is working perfectly. So in our master comp, what we want to do is start layering in our atmospherics. Now, that's what brings so much believability to a scene like this. So let's go ahead. Just before we do, I think the clouds need a little bit of independent treatment here. They're a bit bright. So I'm just going to put a color correction curves on the clouds. I'm just going to pull a little bit of darkness in the bottom end. That's probably going to do it there. So the first thing I want to lay in, when we see a waterfall like this, we tend to see a bit of a haze that's coming up from where the waterfall hits. Now, obviously, if this waterfall was 1,000 feet in the air, we wouldn't see that haze at this level. But I do want to see something down in here. I'm just going to go layer, new, solid, and we're going to make this one black. I will make it middle grey. No, black's fine. We'll go okay, and we're going to call this water haze low, and make it comp size go okay. I'm going to pull that all the way down to the bottom above the clouds, and we'll just go into our left view. We'll make it a 3D layer. We'll go into our left view, and we want to make sure that that is out in front of the trees towards our cliff. Probably about there is fine. Probably a bit closer to the cliff actually. Let's go ahead and make sure that it's closer to the cliff than it is to the trees. Come back to our camera view and scale that up to fit our scene. And just make sure that it's still in shot, and that looks fine. So we're just going to isolate that for a sec. And the effect I'm going to use is a fractal noise. So we just go down to noise and grain, fractal noise, and it's pretty close to what I'm looking for. It's a little bit small, so go ahead, go into the transform and just raise the scale slightly. And the next thing I'm going to do, in fact, I'll animate it first. So at frame 0, just Alt click on the stopwatch and type in time times, let's make it about 100. We'll see how that's working. And the idea is, we'll just do a RAM preview of it. The idea is we want it to evolve, a sort of boil around and bubble around a little bit. So we'll see that in real time. And that's not too bad. That's working okay. And the other thing we need to animate is the turbulence, the offset turbulence. So just click on the stopwatch and move that turbulence down at frame 0. And then at frame 100, let's go ahead and move it up. And I want to move it up and to the left. And the reason for that is we're going to have a bit of wind happening in the scene. And that way we've got this moving up and to the left. So just twirl this up. Next thing I want to do is put a little bit of fall off on this. But before we do, let's go ahead and change this to a screen mode. Just pull this across a little bit. So set it to screen transfer mode. And I'm just going to, under the fractal noise, add an effect, transition linear white. Put it at 180. Wind it down to about here in the scene, and then feather it up. And that's going to work nicely. So what you'll be left with, if I just highlight this or isolate this layer and just do a quick preview of it, you'll see it's evolving and it's moving up, and that's going to work okay. Now I think the movement is a little bit too extreme, so just back in the fractal noise with the turbulence offset, Let's make sure that that end position isn't so far up. Just a little bit of subtle movement is all we're looking for. So that's going to be fine. And the other thing we want to do is restrict it to this area down in here. So I'm going to use an ellipse tool. Just click and drag. You can hold Shift and Control and just drag it up to about here. And hit F. Give it a bit of a feather. And that's going to work nicely. So the only thing we need to do now is just hit T for transparency and drop it down a little bit. And that's going to work nicely for our haze layer. We might just grab that mask and just Control T. I'm just going to squash it down a little bit and then move it up. And then increase the feather on it. There we go. Subtlety is what it's all about in this game, guys. I think I've said it about 8 million times. So I think that's nice and subtle, and that's going to work nicely for us. So there's our water haze. Let's get some rain in there. And to do that, we'll go New, Solid, and we'll call this Rain. And we'll call it Main. So it's the main rain. Make it comp size. I'm going to pull this down. Actually, we'll leave it under our color correction but on top of everything else. Now I could use a particle system for this, but I'm going to use some cheap and nasty. So I'm just going to type in rain over here. We're going to use the CC rainfall. I think it does a fairly good job for what we're looking for. And just come in here a little bit. We'll probably increase the drop size, maybe go to 5 on the drop size. And we'll increase the scene depth a little bit. Increase the amount of drops. And we'll set the layer to a screen mode. Now at the moment that rain is falling straight down and we want some wind, so let's go ahead and pull the wind into the negative. That's going to pull it over to the left. And let's go ahead and see how that rain is falling speed wise and whether we have too many. I think we've got too many particles there. So let's go ahead and pull that back down again. That's probably going to do it. And I think the speed is okay on that as well. Okay, so that rain is going to work from the camera position out to about 40 or 50 feet away. Beyond that, we don't really see the drops of rain. What we do is we tend to see sheets of rain, and the next time it's raining heavily, go out and have a good look and you'll see exactly what I mean. So we need to replicate that process. So I'm just going to go Layer, New, Solid. This is going to be our far rain. Make it comp size, go OK. And I'm just going to place a noise, fractal noise on that. And I'm going to independently transform the scale. So just untick the uniform transform. I think the size is not too bad. Width-wise, we just need to transform the height. Something like that is okay. Maybe even come in a little bit on the width. Something like that is okay. Let's get the contrast happening here a little bit more. Just pull it down a little bit. Just something like that looks pretty good. Now on the evolution, go ahead and alt click on the stopwatch. We'll go time times, let's say 70. So that's evolving nicely, and now we just need to do our falling, and we do that through our offset turbulence. So just click on the stopwatch at frame 0 and just move that up, and at frame 100 just pull it down. Let's go ahead and see if the speed is working okay for us. It's not too bad. It's meant to represent the rain that's behind the cliff. So let's go ahead and pull that down and put it between the cliff. And in fact, our water haze low is in totally the wrong position. It needs to be up in front of the waterfall only. Not that it really matters, it is a 3D layer. Now our far rain at the moment is not a 3D layer, and we need to make it a 3D layer. So toggle our switches, switches to 3D, let's go to a left view and let's push it back, and it needs to sit behind the cliff. So we'll come in a little bit. Needs to sit behind the cliff, but in front of the sky. Somewhere about there should be fine. We'll go back to our camera view and scale it up. Hold shift, scale that up, and we also want to set that to a screen mode, and you can see that that's falling up behind the cliff. The only thing we need to do now is to dial in our transparency, so put it down to 0 and then just start to dial it in there. Now what I'm going to do is come up a little bit here, and I'm going to RAM preview just to show you that that little bit of subtle sheet rain makes a huge difference in the background there. So you can see that sheet rain that's happening up the top. I don't think it's working exactly the way it should be. In fact, it's a little bit hot, so let's pull this down to about 15. Subtlety is the key. You don't know it's there until we remove it. So it's in the right place and it's working well. Let's go ahead and duplicate this, Control D, and rename it. And this one's going to be called Mid-Rain. Now where this goes is up in between the water haze and the cliff and the trees. So we'll make sure that in 3D space it's in the right place. So it needs to come back here. Somewhere about, I'd say about there should be fine. This is the waterfall haze down the bottom. So let's go back to our camera view and scale that back in. And that's working okay. So if we just isolate that for a sec, that haze is the wrong scale. It's a lot closer to us now, so we need to go into the transform settings and scale it up a little wider, scale it up a little taller, a little bit wider again. Something like that should be okay. And we want the evolution to actually change a lot more. So if we just hit U, and we'll change that 70, let's change it from 70 to say 150. And we'll see how that's going to evolve. We can see there that that's working okay. Let's go ahead and do a quick RAM preview just to make sure that that's working okay. And it is, but the speed, the falling speed has to change. So let's go ahead and go to that offset turbulence, and let's pull it down lower so it falls faster, and at the starting position let's go ahead and move that up as well. So that's looking pretty good, and if I toggle that on and off, you'll see that it's just subtle. We can bring up the transparency and maybe pull that up to say 20, and that's just going to nicely float across our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and do a RAM preview and show you where we're up to with this one. So there's the first 50 frames, and I think it's coming along nicely. You can tell that we've got this sheet rain coming across. We've got the finer sheet rain in the background over there. I think the waterfall's working well. We've got the haze at the bottom. We could probably knock that haze back in transparency a little bit. It's a little bit too dominant down the bottom there. That's a personal preference thing. I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Just transparency. Knock this back to say 50. Maybe even more. I'm gonna knock that back to 35. And that's going to work okay. So our scene's looking good, but we want lightning in the scene. And the way we do that is I did mention before that we had this beauty pass that was a lightning beauty pass, and that is far more accurate when it comes to how lightning actually works in the real world and how it illuminates things within a scene. So this is how we're actually going to do it. At the moment, we've got our master comp. So if we come over to, let's tidy up our project up here. Let's put all the comps into the comp subdirectory. Let's move these up into the comps directory. And up the top, we've got our audio. So we're going to get our timing for our lightning off the thunder audio. What we need to do is make a duplicate of this master comp in a lightning state, and then we're just going to animate between the two in a render comp. So first thing we'll do is we'll just grab our master comp, pull that down onto a new composition, and we're just going to rename that comp render comp. And so in our render comp, we want two copies of the master comp. One is our lightning copy and the other is our normal copy. So let's go ahead and grab our master comp, Control D to duplicate it. And we're going to call this master comp lightning. I'm going to pull that down on top of our master comp in our new render comp. So if we double click on that master comp lightning, it's an exact duplicate of our other one, so we need to fine tune it. Now our cliff is a pre-comp, and if we look at that cliff, all of our layers are in that pre-comp, so we need to duplicate that pre-comp as well in a lightning state. So go ahead and grab the cliff only in the project window, Control D to duplicate, and then hit enter. And this one is cliff only lightning. Double click on cliff only lightning, and we're just going to replace the footage of the beauty pass. Just highlight the layer, hold Alt and drag that down on top. That gives us that layer there. We're also going to tweak some of the other settings there. First of all, the shadows, let's switch those off altogether. We don't need those. It's illuminated from a different direction now. And we also want, we don't need the beauty pass. That was used for a track matte for the shadows. We've got our reflections, and we have an effect on our reflections for the histogram here. So what we want to do is pull our reflections up a lot brighter, like that. And also our specular, let's crank that up, maybe even switch that to an add layer. And if we come back to our master comp lightning, we need to replace this cliff only with our new lightning cliff only. So just highlight the layer, hold Alt, click and drag that down. So there's our lightning cliff version there. We also need our water haze down the bottom, needs to come up a little bit in transparency. We need our far rain, hit transparency or T, and it needs to come up a little bit. We need our mid rain, hit T for transparency. It's already on, no, this is our main rain, sorry. So while we've got our main rain selected, we're going to increase the amount of drops in the rain. Not too much, probably about that, probably double them, because we will see with the extra light in the scene from the lightning, we will see more raindrops. And the cliff trees, let's go ahead and treat those as well. We'll go with a color correction curves, and let's brighten those up. Mainly just the high end. Probably okay. And our mid rain, hit T and bring the transparency of our mid rain up a little bit. Now we're going to go into our color correction. We'll leave everything as is, except we will add an exposure, an effect, and we're going to crank the exposure up a little bit, but we're going to gamma down a little bit on it. Something like that looks okay. And then also our cloud layer. down the bottom, we're going to put a bit of an exposure on it as well. So color correction, exposure, and we'll go ahead and expose that up a little bit, maybe gamma down. We'll just highlight this for a sec. In fact, let's go ahead and get rid of the curves, color correction, just put a straight exposure straight on it, crank it up, gamma it down, something like that. And we could even duplicate the clouds, Control D, and then the second layer, let's put it as a maybe even an add layer, and maybe pull that down a little bit. Something like that's okay, and then transparency, maybe knock it back slightly, just so that we've got some lightning happening in the sky there. Maybe bring this down a touch, probably about there. Looks okay. So we're looking pretty good for our, it's mainly our trees, I think, that need a little bit more work. So I might just reset the curves on those trees, and in fact we'll get rid of the curves, and we're going to go color correct, and we'll expose those trees up a little bit as well. Let's crank them up. Something like that's okay, I think. Maybe a little bit more. And then we'll just put in a color correction tint and wind it in to where we want it. That looks pretty good. So if we come into now our render comp, with our two layers, we've got our lightning layer and we've got our normal layer, and you can see that we're really getting that lightning effect. Now we just need to animate it. So with the master comp lightning selected, hit T, and we need our timing, which we get from our audio. So right at the top we've got some rain with thunder, and you can see from the waveform where the thunder is, which is about here. So we'll try and time our lightning for that. In reality, lightning sort of happens a little bit before the thunder, unless it's right on top of you. But with the clouds doing what they are, we can probably get away with that. So opacity, set a keyframe at 0, and then come over 2, come over 1, drop it down to say 30, come over 1, drop it back up to 100, come over 2, down to 0. I'm going to come over 2, create a keyframe at 0, over 1, up to 100, drop it down to say 40, back up to 100, and then down maybe over 3 frames down to 0. So let's have a quick look at whether that lightning is working. It has to feel organic. It also has to happen very quickly. Lightning happens a lot quicker than 1/25 of a second, which is 1 frame in our comp. So don't be afraid to put keyframes. One of the few times you can put keyframes right next to each other. So that feels pretty good. I might just stretch these out, this second little lot. Let's pull those out a little bit further. Let's just see if that's working a bit better. Maybe put them closer together. And then we might even pull these further apart, just so that it looks, if it looks on the timeline scattered, then that's pretty much the effect that we're going to get. What I'm going to do is I'm getting this double flicker effect, and it drops down here and then back up again. I'm going to take this one out, and I'm going to hold the lightning flash and see if that makes a difference. I think that works a lot better. So we've got these little flickers and then a big burst, and then it drops down. So it's working pretty well. I'm going to go ahead and do a full RAM preview, and we'll have a look at our shot. So I might even do a full screen look, and we'll RAM preview that through. So a lot of the things that we've covered in this tutorial, and just like all of my tutorials, what I really try to do is to give you guys a starting point for you to use your own creativity. And I really think that if you give this tutorial a go, it'll start to inspire you to create these sorts of effects. In order to sell an effect like this, you have to have probably the #1 tool for any composite artist. You have to use it, and that is your powers of observation. You've got to understand how things work in the real world. Most people would use rain just using a CC or a particle effect without understanding that rain actually falls in sheets, and beyond a certain distance, that's all you see is sheets of rain. Snow works exactly the same way. The speed of the water falling from the mouth is crucial to the believability of the scale of the scene. The slight movement in the trees is expected. You know, the rain is falling sideways. Everything is falling in a direction that is consistent with a bit of wind, and that's correct. The lightning, as it bursts, is actually based on a real world phenomenon, which is a bright light from a different direction to your key light. It stands to reason that your key light is coming from a direction that if it was covered by clouds and there was lightning, then there would be no key light. So it has to come from a different direction. All of these things put together add believability points when it comes to a viewer understanding what's going on in the scene. And so you can see with some pretty simple assets, we've got something that looks A, cinematic, but B, it's believable. It looks like it would work. Now, this is a quick tutorial. It only took an hour to sort of run through it. Obviously, a shot like this, you would spend a lot more time fine-tuning and tweaking, and this is not by any means the best that we can do with these assets. And I think you can do a lot more if you're patient with the process, you're subtle with your settings, and you make sure you tick all the boxes for those visual markers that I'm talking about. So definitely grab the assets and have a go. If you're interested in how we created the entire scene, this will be available, the entire process, the 3D, the view, creation of the environment, the waterfall, will be available as a workshop purchase, and you'll be able to purchase the whole thing and put the whole scene together and see how I've done that so that you can create your entire scene yourself. That's about it for me, guys. Until next time, bye for now.